Hey, creators, hopefully you had a good weekend. We'll go ahead and get started right away because we've got a lot to cover today. Going to give a quick shout out to 4th Hour Aid Day because they've been watching their videos continuously and getting them done, so I appreciate that. But today we're going to move on. Our topic today is to prepare for war. Last class, we learned about how the relations between the British and the colonists fell apart due to the British acts and taxes, ultimately leading to the Intolerable Acts, which the colonists basically couldn't stand. All right. So key questions today. Question 1, what battle began the American Revolution? Question 2, how did the Second Continental Congress start to act like a government and prepare for war? Question 3, why was the Battle of Bunker Hill such an important conflict for colonists? And then question 4, how did the American Revolution begin? So, looking at that, we have a First Continental Congress. So because of the Intolerable Acts and everything that was happening in Boston, the colonies decided to have a meeting again, kind of like the Albany Congress way back when, during the French and Indian War. This time they're meeting to decide what should we do about Great Britain. Okay, so what it was basically a meeting that took place in Philadelphia in September and October of 1774 to decide what the colonies should do next. Now what they decided there, number 1, they demanded the repeal of the Intolerable Acts. So they basically contacted the king and said, hey, we need to get rid of these acts. Don't write repeal like that because I spelled it wrong on the PowerPoint somehow, but that's incorrect. So they demanded that they get rid of the Intolerable Acts on them. Second thing, they basically wanted to tell the king they have the right to govern themselves. Third thing, they called for a trained militia. And then finally, because it's worked before, they boycotted British goods. Now, with this, they send this to Britain and wait for a response back. And Britain does respond. Britain's reaction to the First Continental Congress was pretty simple. They reacted with force. So what they did is they wound up sending a bunch more soldiers to Boston, okay, and they started basically enacting stricter penalties and stricter enforcement of all the British acts, which leads us to the battles of Lexington and Concord. Okay, these were basically the shots heard around the world. They're the shots that kicked off the American Revolution. So on the night of April 18th, 1776, Paul Revere and William Dawes basically rode out to warn the Minutemen that the British were on their way. Now, everybody's probably heard that story. The British are coming, the British are coming, all that. Well, everybody was British at this point, so it's basically the regulars are coming. The British soldiers were called regulars, some were called redcoats, things like that. The first shot of the American Revolution was fired at Lexington, Massachusetts, about 20 miles from Boston. Kind of basically a rout. The British opened fire, wiped them out, looking for guns. Then they moved on to Concord. Once they arrived in Concord, they met a heavy resistance from the colonists there and were started to push back. The British decided to retreat to Boston, and on the way back, the colonists just kind of set aside, like they did during the French and Indian War, and picked off the British soldiers as they were going back. So almost 300 British soldiers were killed or wounded during this time. So that's the battles of Lexington and Concord. Yeah, just a second. Sorry about that, got interrupted. So the British retreated to Boston, and now things are on like Donkey Kong, okay? Which leads us to the Second Continental Congress. Okay. All right, so this leads us to the Second Continental Congress. This was a new meeting between the colonies. This took place in May of 1775. Okay. You had some new delegates that showed up. You have Thomas Jefferson, John Hancock, and Patrick Henry, some pretty vital guys to the start of our new country. And at the Second Continental Congress, they decided on 3 things. Number 1 is they formed the Continental Army. So now we're going to have an army of regular soldiers, not just Minutemen. 2, they made George Washington commander of the army. And 3, they decided to print their own money to pay for war expenses. This seems like a good idea, but it's actually going to turn out to be a bad idea because, and I'll show you in class how this works, but they printed their own paper money to get things going. So, with this, the colonists divided, and they were split into 2 groups, basically. Those colonists loyal to Britain were called loyalists. those basically wanting independence for the colonies were called patriots. Colonists who wanted independence were called patriots. Colonists who were loyal to the British Crown were called loyalists. The next big thing that happens is Fort Ticonderoga. So basically on May 10th, 1775, a man named Ethan Allen and 83 men that were called the Green Mountain Boys captured Fort Ticonderoga. Fort Ticonderoga is located kind of up in here, in New York. The men seized weapons and cannons, and they later moved those cannons to Boston, which is going to become important with the Battle of Bunker Hill. The Green Mountain Boys, one of the Green Mountain Boys, I guess Miss Bettino's ancestor was a Green Mountain Boy. Petitions to Britain. So there were two things that they sent to Britain to show that people were uncertain if they wanted to do this or not. So people were uncertain if they wanted to go to war with Britain. So they sent two different resolutions, and it showed the uncertainty in the deal. The first resolution they sent was called the Olive Branch Petition, which stated that the colonists were loyal to the king. Now, the olive branch is just that. Olive branch is a symbol for peace, so we called it the Olive Branch Petition for that. So they sent that one to the king. They also sent him something called the Declaration of the Causes and Necessities of Taking Up Arms. And in this one, said the opposite, said that they were ready to die for their freedom. So the colonists were sending them mixed messages to Britain about what was going to happen. And then we're going to get a third document that's going to be created by Thomas Jefferson called the Declaration of Independence. And that one's going to basically give us the idea of reasons why we're separating from Britain and what we're going to do because we're separating from Britain. The next battle we're going to talk about is the Battle of Bunker Hill. These were early battles in the American Revolution, and really the first time that the Continental Army of the colonies had faced off against British regulars. Battle of Bunker Hill took place in Boston. The British won the battle after 3 different attacks because the American militia ran out of ammunition. Basically, they were holding off the British and holding their own against them until they ran out of supplies and ammunition. At the Battle of Bunker Hill, it's famous for the commander saying, don't shoot until you see the whites of their eyes. So it can give you an idea of how close the combat was. And we'll talk about that in class, as well as kind of get a little demonstration to see how close these guys were when they're shooting at each other. The battle proved that the Americans could stand up to Britain's professional soldiers. So even though we lost, it was still a victory because it showed that we could hang with them and we could fight with them. And then finally up in Canada, George Washington sent 2 commanders up to Canada here. The first commander that went up was Richard Montgomery, and then followed by Benedict Arnold. They invaded Canada and attacked the city of Quebec in December of 1775. Unfortunately for them, they ran out of supplies. They were forced to eat their shoes to try to survive, which is kind of crazy. And the attack failed. So we decided, let's leave Canada to the British. We're not going to mess with those. So to sum everything up, basically the colonists had 2 meetings where they tried to decide what to do. The Battle of Lexington and Concords were the shots heard around the world, which really started off the American Revolution. We had some key early victories at Fort Ticonderoga with Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys. We tried to make peace with the king by sending him the Olive Branch Petition. And we also sent him some mixed messages by telling him we're ready to die for our freedoms. And then we'll later get the Declaration of Independence by Thomas Jefferson. And finally, early battles didn't go well. We lost the British at the Battle of Bunker Hill because we were ill-supplied and not prepared for war. So if you have any questions, shoot me an email. Once again, I'm sorry for getting this one out a little bit late. And then I'll see you guys tomorrow in class. Hope you have a good night.